Hello, my name is Christina Groves and I'm from Sturt University. I'm presenting today on behalf of Christina, Davidson and myself, and we'll be presenting data and findings from a study that we've recently been involved with in studying classroom talk, classroom interaction in lessons. The title of our presentation is called "If We're Not Doing the Conversation, We Are Not Learning Anything." Some very wise words from a young 5-year-old student in a classroom lesson. Talking about talk in the early years. Talking about talk. Talking about talk, where talk itself is the object of the conversation, is defined as meta talk. So today's presentation aims to understand how meta talk in the early years classrooms is a student learning resource. Why this is important is for understanding and extending the dialogic possibilities for meaning making in literacy learning through this notion of meta talk, or a language to talk about talk with one another in classrooms. The study of talk about talk in interaction is quite an extensive field of work, but today we're really focusing in on the notion of meta talk itself. So the 1980s work by Deborah Schifrin really started to think about what this means for people's understanding of what's going on in talk, about how we use language to talk about talk itself, that it can serve at its own meta language in the doing of it. So today's presentation, we're situated within Newman's work particular, who studied meta talk in secondary classrooms in the UK. So when she was talking about meta talk, she was really focusing on the ways that talk itself is the object of its own attention, and how it supports students' understanding about language and its interpersonal dimensions, while also and at the same time strengthening the possibility that this knowledge is applied in the doing or the conduct of talk itself. Now, this is pretty an important piece of work, because quite often in classrooms, when people are listening to or talking about talk itself, it becomes down to a managerial kind of role. For example, in early years classrooms, it might be put your hand up to speak. So when teachers are orienting to talk itself, they're orienting to student behaviours. Shh, sit down, wait your turn, for example. So the idea around talk or talk about talk with students, it's generally an under-researched field of study, particularly so in the early years of schooling. Developing knowledge about meta talk and its connection to students' understanding of their own learning remains taken for granted in practice, and it's so strengthening how meta talk itself supports students' understanding about language, while strengthening how this particular knowledge is applied in lesson talk is required. That's the direction that we're taking in this study. So our position from our long history of work studying classroom talk and interactions in classroom lessons, particularly in the area of literacy, is that talk in lessons is about communicating and meaning making. But particularly talk about talk and interaction extends the possibilities for building on students' interactional competencies for meaning making, for making meanings of talk, of interaction, how we're participating with one another, and of the kind of text that young people are engaging with in their classroom lessons. So for us, meta talk is how a more explicit and responsive dialogic education happens. So in lessons, and as we've found in our work, it encompasses these two broad dimensions. One, knowing and articulating So involving mutually produced between one another in the course of an interaction, in the flow of an interaction, and it's understood locally between those people present. It's a meta language that young people get drawn into or stirred into about how talk facilitates their learning, but interaction at the same time. 2, it's about how students and teachers share in the responsibility for managing discussions. It's a little bit of a different take on how we understand or what we understand classroom lessons to be. The broad position is about talk is about meaning making, and talk is the hot spot. It is the place where education happens. So as we understand, all children are meaning makers. They come to school interactionally competent prior to school. But when they get to school, something happens. With the logistics of being in a classroom, with 20 or so other young people. So becoming a meaning maker in school talk requires changing the focus on or the attention to the kind of talk and interaction patterns that accommodate communicating and interacting among larger groups of people, and how we can draw on language about language, talk about talk within at the same time. So the study that we'll be presenting to you today that focuses in on talk and interaction is critical when we're particularly expecting young people to participate in discussions in very active ways, but there is less explicit focus on developing the meta talk or the language to talk about this participation and what it means for young people in their learning. So the study that we're looking at and we're presenting to is a one-year competitively funded project. It was based around action research with 12 teachers across the state of New South Wales, Australia. 4 of these teachers were kindergarten teachers. In New South Wales, Australia, that is the first year of formal schooling, and that's the data that we're particularly interested in today. The teachers were from rural sites in regional locations, but also in metropolitan schools as well. The data that we were drawing on recorded audio and video teacher conferences where we would come together with them to facilitate their action research projects as they were coming to understand how talk or how their own dialogic practices facilitated literacy learning or not. We're drawing on classroom lessons, the researcher visits, lessons and debrief interviews, as well as teacher reflection journals. Our analysis draws on conversation analysis, in particular to determine the interactional phenomena of interest. Here, how talk, about talk, meta talk, itself is brought into the interactive flow of lessons. Conversation analysis is particularly interested in turn taking, and here when we're speaking about school talk, in lessons or discussions. So what we're trying to understand is how the talk and interaction itself is the object of the talk in the interaction itself. So for the teachers in the study, it was about becoming attuned to the talk, but it was also opening up that attunement to the students at the same time. So for us, becoming attuned to talk requires teachers and students noticing and then managing aspects of talk in interaction. That is, who has the floor, who gets to speak, whose turns are privileged and evaluated or ignored, how the turns are managed. For example, does the teacher require the students to put their hands up to indicate that they want to speak or have a response, etc. The role of the talk for meaning making and what counts as relevant. Our particular focus today, though, is in how talk and interaction is spoken about in lessons. We're drawing on one particular classroom, and this is Stella with her kindergarten classroom, who was really focused in on how do I have more children participate and listen to each other in those participation in their classroom discussions. So this is her little classroom of kindergarten students, and I'm drawing on some transcripts, segments now to indicate or draw out for you aspects of meta talk that shows the way that this teacher with her students focused in on classroom talk for its own sake in order to facilitate learning about it. So she begins. So we're having a discussion, and first we're going to tell you all of the things that we've been learning about our talking. So what I think we might need to do for that to happen is for us to have a conversation. So Nate says, well, when we talk with someone, we need to have eye contact. 5-year-old Evelyn agrees. I agree, she says, because when we're listening to somebody else, you have to have eye contact so you can understand what they're saying. It might help you hear it. So anyway, you might hear what they say properly, and you might not hear what they say. So you might not learn anything. You might not learn the thing that they said. Looking helps you. Nate jumps in there and says, yeah, if you're having eye contact, that means the other people who are talking to you or you are talking to them, they know that you're paying attention. So what I've highlighted here in the green text here is that in this short little interchange between the teacher and Nat and Evelyn, they're drawing out features of talk and interaction for the sake of how that helps them learn. So these young people are focusing on what they're learning. You might learn something. You're paying attention in terms of the interaction as well. To go on, Ava says, well, don't interrupt, Nate, but I agree with Evelyn too, because you can do eye contact, but you also can don't put your hands up, because when you piggyback then, people come in and they talk with their ideas. Elijah questions that, but I wonder why we piggyback. Well, you listen, you add on to other people's questions, suggestions, and say what you think. So you add on to other people's ideas, she says. But if I saw you didn't get to talk much, I would let him in the conversation. Alexa says, well, when people don't talk, that means there's not use doing the conversation because they're not learning anything. Because I think, says Flynn, if you're not listening and learning anything, you're not learning about what we're learning about. And they're not getting the meaning of what teachers are saying and what the other kids are trying to say to them. So yes, there's a lot of talk here about talk and interaction, but what does it actually mean for young people learning? What does it mean for the teachers, and what's actually happening here? So what we can see across these sequence of turns is that these young 5- and 6-year-old students, they could draw explicitly on a shared and common language. Eye contact, listening, learning, building on, piggybacking particularly on both these two elements, talk, and they drew out words like discussion, telling, conversation, suggestions, getting the meaning, understanding, saying what you think, etc. And they also had a shared language about interaction, paying attention, listening, hearing, maintaining eye contact, adding on to other people's ideas, agreeing, etc., letting other people into the conversation. This is remarkable when you think about these are 5-year-old and 6-year-old students who have got a meta language, a language to talk about talk and interaction and what this means for their learning. So what we found, and it was an unexpected finding for our particular study, is that to become more dialogic in classroom discussions, teachers and students needed to use and so develop a language to talk about dialogue, a language to talk about talk and interaction. And two, that the legitimacy of the meta talk was evident. And it was evident there in that little transcript excerpt. It's because it was observable and it was taken up by both the teacher and the students' talk. So the teachers and the students were orienting to it across the little sequence. The ways that a talk itself became an object of the talk, so it became witnessable in shaping what happened. For example, when the young people were saying, "Don't interrupt," when Nate interrupted, they're also facilitating and managing the conversations. So for these young teachers, students and teachers, they used MetaTalk to participate, to manage the turn taking, and they could identify it for themselves, initiating turns. They developed an awareness about theirs and other people's turn taking and developed a consciousness about the contributions of others. So they were not just focusing on what they had to say, which was quite typical in these early years classrooms, but also in relationship to how it helped other people. So to conclude, MetaTalk formed a necessary part of the locally produced discourse shared among students and their teachers, and it assisted them to manage and comprehend their interactions and so their learning. It enabled young people to build on their own interactional competencies. From the early years of schooling, establish a strong foundation from which to build the shared responsibility for coordinating, managing and contributing to the lesson talk as it progressed, and how that sets in train a strong foundation to move through their years of schooling. And for the teachers in our study, it became a necessary condition for a sustained dialogic turn. So to conclude, we want to finish with Erin's little contribution that opened up our conversation for today. Well, when you listen, you add on to other people's questions, suggestions, and you say what you think. So you can add on to other people's ideas. When people don't talk, that means there's no use doing the conversation because they're not learning anything. Some very wise words from young Erin to show us how important it is for a sustained dialogic turn in classrooms to open up this area of MetaTalk with a distinct focus.